7 pillars of support for inclusive education.
Pillar 1 is developing positive attitudes. The development of positive attitude in educator is central to the accomplishment of inclusive education. Positive attitude allow and encourage practices which, according to Hobbes and Wesling 1999, virtually guarantee the success of inclusion. The number of researchers have found that attitudes govern the day-to-day practices of classroom teachers, meaning that many decisions about what teaching strategies to use or what sort of activity to involve children in are based on attitude. Where teachers want to involve all learners, they generally tend to devise activities which support the goal. Negative attitude toward inclusive education have been correlated with low expectation for the achievement of children with disability, which in turn has a negative impact on student performance. According to Murphy 1996, negative teacher attitude toward inclusion, once developed, are extremely difficult to change. This highlights the importance of pre-service teacher education, which engender positive attitude towards inclusive education in beginning teachers. While positive attitude may do much to promote the success of an inclusive education, negative attitudes will surely ensure its failure. Thank you.
Pillar 2. Supportive policy and leadership. Supportive policy. There are now a number of international agreements and declarations which support inclusive education. The most notable being the 1994 UNESCO document known as the Salamanca Statement. This internationally recognized statement is unequivocal, in its support for inclusive education. It has been argued that international documents like the Salamanca Statement have produced most noticeable outcomes in the move towards inclusive school. However, while few people disagree with the positive impact the Salamanca Statement and others like it have had in the move towards inclusive education, Blaschow cautioned that declaration may create conditions for policy practices, that is legislation, but they do not determine them. Slee Cook and Lindsay in 1999 and 2004 argue that local policy and legislation should not restrict access, as it often does, but rather needs to be consistent with the international policy. However, while local inclusion policy, when consistent with international standards, can be helpful, Lindsay in 2004 mentioned it. So there are many instances where good inclusion policy and legislation have not produced successful outcomes, mentioned in Kesnarowski and Gardner 1999. Where local inclusion legislation and policy is consistent with international standards and yet still does not produce successful outcomes, this is likely the result of a disconnect between the intent of the policy and the willingness of local educator to comply with the intent and spirit of the requirements. A key element in creating inclusive school is the support of school and system leaders, said by Anderson Lupart 2000, Bohr and Brown 2001, Lorman 2001, Lorman et al. 2005, Lorman and Raymond 2005. Conversely, even supportive school leaders will have difficulty promoting inclusive education in an environment devoid of supportive policy and or legislation. This sort of policy is useful for support when the move towards an inclusive school or district setting by educational leader is questioned, said by Kennedy and Fisher 2001. This implies a symbolic relationship between school leadership and policy and law.
Leadership. What is leadership? A leader is the one who inspires and motivates action. Having a can-do personality and a strong leadership skills is the key to leading the change. At the school level, model of a shared leadership is important in assisting in the acceptance of an inclusive approach by all members of a school committee. Shared leadership is the leadership style that broadly distributes leadership responsibility such that people within a team and organization lead each other. Shared leadership is also commonly thought of as the serial emergence of a multiple leaders over the life of the team, stemming from interaction amongst the team members in which at least one team member tries to influence other members or the team in general. Shared leadership is an emergent team property of a mutual influence and shared responsibilities among team members, whereby they lead each other towards a global achievement.
Pillar 3, School processes grounded in research based practices. At the school level, there are a number of organizational factors which needs to be considered. There is a need for innovative scheduling of time and facilities, and this needs is especially acute at the grade 7 to 12. Children may not learn best in 50-minute subject blocks, and moving from classroom to classroom, working multiple times. Teacher is also a practice that needs to be examined. Kennedy and Fisher suggested that it might be beneficial to have, say, all the grade 8 teachers grouped together as an administrative and planning unit. Teachers need to contemplate new rules for themselves, moving away from being science teacher to being teacher of children. In terms of other organizational factors, it is essential that children be organized into heterogeneous groups. And some schools could even consider the use of multi-aged mixed ability class groupings. Creative thinking and intelligent modification and adaptation of curriculum in this instance can overcome many of these issues. The central questions of why we have schools and what children need to learn in order to prepare them for life after school need to be revisited and carefully considered by all involved in education.
Classroom processes. Other organizational factors include the need for classroom to share women and other resources, like to engage in meaningful professional development. Lorimer developed Depot and Sharma in 2005 suggested that schools support inclusive education through invisible builds most incentive practices, working closely with the team of therapists and consulting who mostly stay behind the scenes in the supportive relationship. Teachers should work in different teams and with teaching assistants and other support staff. So this means that teacher and assistants see themselves as being in different roles to achieve the same ends. Teachers should not be downloading the entire responsibility for the child's education on an assistant. Similarly, teachers should not take on this role entirely themselves and should be able to rely on assistance for help when, where, and when it is needed and for and useful.
Pillar number 4, flexible curriculum and pedagogy present significant challenges for educators trying to implement an inclusive approach to education. There is a tendency for curriculum in today's school jurisdiction to be linear, overly specific, centralized, and unresponsive to the needs of minority groups. Inclusion benefits from more child-centered modes of instruction, or even those which concentrate on relationship and the learning that occurs in small groups, known as decentered learning. Cloud calls for a reformed curriculum broad enough to suit the needs of students with a wide range of disabilities. He sees special education as primarily a curriculum problem and argues that it is only through a greater understanding of the curriculum that we may hope to break through to an understanding of individual problems. This sort of view has led to the notion of universal curriculum design, which, according to Blamius, operates under three principles, which are: first, provide multiple representations of content; second, provide multiple options for expression and control; third, provide multiple options for engagement and motivation. Teachers today are encouraged or required to either informally modify curriculum or do so this formally through an individual program plan. While modification of curriculum to suit the individual student with a disability is a widely accepted practice, it does have its critics. Critics view this type of process as a means of singling out as other and, marginalizing people with disabilities in order to exercise control over them through special programs. Such a tightly constructed plan of learning is seen by critics as leaving little opportunity for a student to direct his or her own learning, and as a result, the instruction becomes teacher centered. It is important that curriculum modification and adaptation not to be seen as only changing the skill of the material. Of course, modification can mean this, but changing the skill level of the material to be taught should be viewed as a final option to try after other adaptations, such as the use of technology or additional human or other resources, have been fully considered. For some children, for example, those with visual impairments only or similar disabilities, modifying the skill level of the material to be taught will be entirely inappropriate.
Pillar 4, Flexible Curriculum and Pedagogy. Pedagogy is critical to all learning and especially in an inclusive environment. Curriculum is what needs to be taught, and pedagogy refers to how the material is to be learned. Grouping based on perceived ability levels is to be avoided, even that which the teacher thinks is relatively well disguised. Children known who is in the low group and the stigma associated with this will likely have a negative impact on self-image of the children in the low group. Secondly, this practice is hard to justify in terms of learning. Children benefit academically and socially from heterogeneous grouping. Teachers need to be flexible in their scheduling. If children are excited about their social studies project leading up to recess, it might be wise to continue with the project after recess and reschedule the conflicting maths for another time. Obviously, elementary school teacher will find this easier to do than their counterparts in the higher grades, pointing once again to the need for schedule reform at this level. The cause of inclusion and the general quality of education will be improved if teachers consider the philosophical point of view and adapt their teaching techniques to be more in line and research on best practices.
Pillar 5, community involvement. There is a wide agreement in the literature that the involvement of community in school is an important element in the success of inclusive education. Not only should schools be reaching out and becoming more involved in the local community, but the community should also be welcomed into school in very concrete ways. The most important group in the wider school community are parents. Indeed, it could be argued that they are not part of the wider community at all, but rather part of the core school community along with educators and students. Without the cooperation and help of the parents, little is accomplished. And Turnbull in 1991, followed by Leroman in 2005, have presented the role of parent as falling into three broad categories. These include parents as the decision makers. Parents are well placed to make decisions with and on behalf of their children. They can also assist others to make decisions by providing valuable background information and insights from their years of experience with the child. Parents as teachers. Parents are often their child's only teacher in their first 4 5 years of life and are well in tune to the learning needs and preferences of the individual. Parents can help as teachers both at home, in the community, and as partners in the classroom. Parents as advocates. It is extremely rare and unlikely to encounter a parent who does not want the best of their child. Given this, parents are often wonderful advocates. Educators who recognize these are well on the road of a productive and collaborative relationship with parents. It is beyond the scope of this paper to provide detailed description of the guidelines for the multiplicity of roles parents can play in schools and classrooms. And this area is well documented in the literature already. Advocacy group, and in case of inclusive education, this generally means disability advocacy group, should be welcomed by educators because they play an essential role as both broad lobby groups and as support to individual and families. Often educators become irritated with this group because of their advocacy role. However, without such group, very little progress would have been made along the road to inclusive education. They hold educators to account and force us to reconsider and reevaluate our views, opinions, and the way of working. They often produce and loan valuable resources and are willing to consult and assist where they can. Advocacy groups will continue to play an influential role in the move towards inclusive education and will become stronger and more people with disabilities themselves become empowered and move into this advocacy role. For example, persons with developmental disabilities, PDD, in Alberta, Canada, partners with many schools and jurisdictions to help ensure smooth transition from both inclusive and segregated schooling to an inclusive post-school life, persons with developmental disabilities. Non-profit groups such as Easter Steels in North America offer a variety of important services, including rehabilitation services, job training, and recreational support. Various groups focusing on specific conditions such as autism or Down syndrome can also provide significant support and resources in order to partner with schools and better enable the practice of inclusion. Many schools foster partnership with these groups and others like them, and in doing so, expand the responsibility for education into the community in a positive and collaborative way.
Pillar 6, meaningful reflection. Reflection has become an increasingly important part of a good teacher's tutorial of strategy for continuous improvement. Educators need to be able to reflect and study because research-based practice is necessary if educators want to stay relevant. The value of reflection is increased when it is based on data collected through systematic observation, becoming action research. A number of teacher tools for reflection have been devised. This includes, but are not limited to, diaries and journals. Lorman provide a rational and template for the use of teacher diaries. The act of writing, they argue, provides teachers with an opportunity for deeper reflection, which is not necessarily afforded to those who do not write their experiences and thought downs. Reflective diaries also have values as a record of learning and growth. Previously developed survey indexes. There are a variety of available surveys and indexes which teacher can fill out in an attempt to gauge where they are at with inclusion and what aspects of their practice they may need to focus on. The British Index for Inclusion is an example of this. However, similar adaptation and scales are widely available for use. Have a colleague review plans, assessment, class structure, instruction, etc. This strategy can be extremely helpful, but requires high level of trust in one's colleague. When approached in a collegial, helpful way, a peer review of practice and possibly even some advice can be helpful exercise for all involved, but it does take courage. If this is too frightening, another alternative is to video record lessons and review this recording alone or with colleagues. Visiting the classroom of others. This is a powerful approach to picking up helpful ideas, advice, and tips for implementation in another context, often with adaptation. Indeed, classroom intervention can be one of the most important types of professional development educators can engage in. Teachers observing each other working in their own context, followed by opportunity to discuss what was, can be mutually beneficial. The visitors get to experience the richness of being temporarily immersed in a different educational setting, and the host is provided with an opportunity not only to showcase good practices, but to also engage in reflection and self-critique with the visiting teacher. Inter-classroom and inter-school professional partnership can be fostered in this way, with the possible result being an ongoing professional sharing and growth. Reflective practice is often spoken of in relation to individual teachers carrying out the sort of activities described above. However, it is important in a climate of reflection to analyze and question all aspects of the inclusive experiences. Even students area where many do not excel as try and reconcile the need of promotion with the need for self-improvement. Reflective practices also provide opportunity to explore personal development opportunities.
Number seven, unnecessary training and resources. Training. For all their good intentions, many teachers feel inadequately trained to meet the demands of an inclusive classroom. Australian survey conducted by Lorman asked teachers what sort of training would be helpful to them, and the response was overwhelmingly in favor of in-class support by professionals and colleagues, possibly in combination with some school-based professional development. One positive model which would seem to support this expressed need is university school partnership arrangement. Describes the success of model where cohort of teachers at school enlist in master degree in inclusive education at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. This group provided leadership in the school and engaged in classroom consulting and other forms of assistance with their colleagues. University professionals deliver the course content on site at school after the instructional hours, and the academic content was modified to be directly applicable to the situation at the school. This sort of an approach seemingly addressed the need for training to be immediately relevant to the educational context in which the teachers were working. Resources. A person perception exists that schools are inadequately resourced to meet the demands of inclusive education. This can be used to benefits of all students, while educators may never be satisfied with the level of resources in school. They can take heart from Anisco and Seba's observation that too many resources might not be good thing as they have tendency to reduce the school capacity to think creatively. Technology is a commonly used resource and has opened up wealth of opportunity for many students. However, it should be used judiciously. Most technology is expensive proposition, and if computer is only used for word processing, it is simply an expensive pain. Assistive technology, when used well and often, is, however, an important resource which needs to be considered. Other resources listed as being helpful to school and teacher include extra time for planning and extra staff in the school acting as a supports.